Hey folks, in this video I'm going to show you how to use the CSS position property. You can use the position property to control exactly where an element will be displayed on the page in relation to itself, a parent element, or even the entire viewport. Now the position property is by default set to static, but you can also set it to relative, absolute, fixed, or sticky. We'll be taking a look at all of these starting with position static. Alright, so I have VS Code open on the left, and then we have the browser open on the right with the local website. So I'm going to start by making a basic website. In the HTML, I'm going to create a paragraph with 50 words of lorem ipsum placeholder text. Then I'm going to duplicate this a bunch of times. And after the first paragraph, I'm going to create a div with a class of block. Alright. Next, let's add some styles. So in our styles, I'm going to set the body tag to have a background color of dark gray, almost black, and a color of white, just because I like dark mode. Now let's also style that block div that we added. So for the block class, I'm going to give it a width of 200 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and a background color of crimson. There we go. So right now, the red block, as well as all the paragraphs, have that default position of static. Static meaning it cannot be moved. Now in CSS, you can reposition elements with the properties top, right, bottom, or left. However, if I add top, and let's say top of 40 pixels to the block, even when I save, nothing happens, again because it's static and we cannot move it. However, we can unlock the ability to use those properties by making the block position relative. So now it's relative, and when I save, you might notice the block has moved down. So with position relative, the block can be positioned relative to what its original static position was. So the top of 40 pixels, it moves the top side of the block 40 pixels down from where it originally was, which was, somewhere up here. So it's kind of like someone pushing the top side of the block down. Now let's try those other properties as well. So I'm going to add right of 40 pixels. And when I save, the element moves 40 pixels to the left, like someone pushing the block from the right side in. Now, if I add bottom of 40 and I save, the block doesn't move. And this is because for relative elements, if you have both top and bottom set, only the top property is going to actually take effect on the element and the bottom is going to be ignored. And the same actually happens for right and left. If I add left of 40 pixels, the block moves 40 pixels to the left of its original static position. So it's actually ignoring this right style here. So if I comment it out so it doesn't take effect and I save, you notice the block doesn't move from where it was with the left of 40 pixels. If I uncomment it, nothing happens. So when you have top and bottom, the top will take priority. And then if you have right and left set, only the left will take priority. And one other thing that you can do with these properties is, we're back in the original static position, you can also set them to a negative number. So let's say I set top to negative 40 pixels. It moves up, and this is because the block is going to be positioned 40 pixels above its original position. So you can think of the negative numbers as kind of like pulling. So the negative 40 pixels of top is as if someone was above the top side of the block, pulling it 40 pixels up. Whereas the positive numbers are kind of like pushing in from the outside. So top of 40 pixels, someone's pushing down from the top side 40 pixels down. All right, so that's how the position relative elements work. Now let's check out what position absolute does. Relative positioning allowed us to position an element relative to its original static position. Absolute positioning goes even further and it lets you position an element relative to its parent or an ancestor element. Position absolute is a lot more powerful, but also a lot more complicated than position relative, and it comes with a few gotchas that you do need to be careful of. So in our styles, if I make the block position absolute instead of relative, you might notice a couple of things have happened. First, an absolutely positioned element is taken completely out of the normal flow of the document, and it's kind of floating over the rest of the page on its own layer. And the other elements around it are going to behave as if it doesn't even exist, which is why the other paragraphs have now moved up in order to occupy the space that the block used to take up. So I'm going to comment out position absolute so it goes back to static. This is the original positioning. And then with absolute, you can see the paragraphs have moved up. Now with position absolute, let's set top of 40 pixels. Now when we do this, the block needs to find a parent or an ancestor to anchor itself to, and to kind of use like a baseline for its own top, right, bottom, or left values. So what happens is the browser is going to start looking at the element's parents and ancestors until it finds one that has its position set to something other than the default static. Now, the block's parent is the body tag, and we didn't set a position on the body tag in our styles, so the browser is going to continue moving up the document up to the HTML tag, which is the parent of the body tag. And then we also didn't position the HTML tag, so finally the browser is going to hit what's called the initial containing block. This is the entire viewport of the website, which is the entire browser window that you can see is visible. So right now, the top edge of the block is positioned 40 pixels down from the top of the viewport with this top of 40 pixels style rule. Now let's also add right of 40 pixels. And when I save, the block is repositioned so that the right edge of the block is 40 pixels in from the side of the viewport. Now, if I add bottom of 40 pixels, nothing happens immediately. However, if I comment out the static height that we had set originally, now you can see that the element has gotten super tall. So what's happening here is that with absolutely positioned elements, if you set both top and bottom properties, the element will actually be allowed to change size in order to position itself in both of those directions. So the top of the block is now 40 pixels from the top of the viewport, and the bottom of the block is also 40 pixels up from the bottom of the viewport. And the same goes with right and left. Let's say if I say left 40 pixels, and I also comment out that static width that we'd set. Now the block is going to grow to be positioned 40 pixels in from both right and left sides of the viewport. And if you're setting top, right, bottom, and left, you can also use a shorthand property in set, and you can set top, right, bottom, and left all at the same time. It's kind of like the shorthand margin and padding properties. So let's comment out the other ones, and setting an inset of 40 pixels. We'll do the same thing that we just had done with the top, right, bottom, and left individually, all of 40 pixels. And you can have one parameter like we have here to be on all four sides. And if I say 40 pixels and 20 pixels, it's going to be 40 pixels in from the top and bottom, and then 20 pixels in from the right and the left. And you can also use 3 numbers if you want to make the bottom different from the top. So now the bottom is going to be 60 pixels. And you can also, of course, say 4 individual numbers if you want to set the 4 sides to different values. So now the left is set to 80. So it's top, right, bottom, and left. All right, so let's comment out the inset and uncomment the width and height. And then let's just go back to what we had originally. And I'm going to add top of 40 pixels again. Okay. Now, a lot of times you are going to want to position an absolute element in relation to not the viewport like we have here, but a different parent element. So let's do that now. In our HTML, I'm going to create another div with a class of parent, and then I'm going to put the block inside the parent div. Now, in our styles, let's style the parent. So for the parent class, let's give it a background color of light gray. And I did save, however, we can't seem to see the parent anywhere on the page. So let's inspect the block div here. And now if I hover over the parent, it's not visible, but it does have a height of 0. Might be a little too small for you to see. And the red block is still positioning itself in relation to the viewport because we didn't set a position on the parent div itself. So let's set position relative on the parent. And now you might see the red block has moved down because it is now positioning itself in relation to the parent div. So the parent div is kind of right here, if you can see that line. And the red block is 40 pixels below it because of the top 40 pixel style. So why is the parent invisible and why does it have a height of 0? Well, this is because the position absolute block is taken out of the normal flow of a document, so the parent is behaving as if the child didn't exist at all, which is why it has no height. And this is one of those pitfalls when working with position absolute. If we want the parent to exist on the page, we have to give it a static height. So in our styles, I'll set the height of the parent to 200 pixels. So now when we save, we can see the parent with that light gray background, and it has the red block inside it, and the block is now positioned 40 pixels down from the top of the parent div. Another thing you can do with position absolute is to stack elements on top of one another. So in our HTML, I'm going to duplicate that block div, and we'll give this one a class of block 2. Then let's target block 2 in our styles. And let's make this also position absolute. And I'll give it a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. And a background color of blue. All right, so now we have our second block inside the gray parent div. And by default, it's going to be positioned 0 pixels from the top and 0 pixels from the left of the parent div. Now you might notice that the blue block is on top of the red block. Now usually you can use the CSS z-index property to stack elements on top of one another. But even without z-index, the browser, as you can see, is going to stack elements based on their order in the HTML, with latter elements getting stacked on top of earlier elements. So if we take a look back at our markup, the blue block 2 div comes after the first red block. So this is why the blue div is on top of the red one. Now if we want the red block to be on top, what we can do is go back to our block class and add z-index of 1. So now the red block is on top of the blue block. And this is because an element with a z-index value is going to stack on top of an element without it. And the higher the z-index number, the higher in the stack that element is going to be. So let's go back to the blue block and let's make it have a z-index of 2. So now this has moved the blue block on top of the red block because the red block only has a z-index of 1. And you can also set z-index to a negative number. So let's try setting the blue block to a z-index of -1. And now it's not only behind the red block, but it's actually disappeared behind the parent as well. So what's happening here? Well, you can think about stacking in a similar way to how absolutely positioned elements need a parent or ancestor that is explicitly positioned to something other than static so that they can anchor themselves to that parent. Otherwise, they are going to position themselves in relation to the overall viewport. So in a similar way, with stacking, the elements need a stacking context to belong to in order to determine what the stack is. And the parent div currently is not a stacking context, so these two blocks, the red and the blue blocks, are actually stacking themselves in relation to the root document, which is the HTML element. And the blue block's negative z-index is pushing it behind the parent div. So there are multiple ways that you can create a stacking context. One is to have the element be either absolute or relative, which the parent is. And they also need to have not just a position explicitly set, but they also need to have a z-index explicitly set to something other than the default value of auto. So for the parent, let's say I set the z-index to 0. Now the parent has created a stacking context containing the red and the blue blocks. You can also create a stacking context by adding certain styles to the element. So let's comment out z-index of 0. And instead, let's add opacity of 0.5. So now you can see the opacity did darken, but you can see the blue block is visible again. And this is because if you add an opacity of less than 1, it is going to create a stacking context of this element, making the parent contain the blue and the red blocks in terms of z-index stacking. Now obviously you may not want this to happen, so there's actually another style rule that you can create that will create a new stacking context, and it's not going to have any side effects like adding an opacity of less than 1. So if you want to just create a stacking context and nothing else, you can add isolation, isolate. So now you can see the blue block is visible, and we don't have a decreased opacity like we did before. And there are quite a few other ways that you can create stacking context. You can read this article on MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, about stacking context and how some styles can create them. And I will have this linked down below in the description. All right, next let's get into position fixed. This allows you to position an element in relation to the entire viewport. So in our HTML, after the parent div, we'll create a new div with a class of fixed. And I'm going to give it a content of this element is fixed. Then in our styles, we'll target the fixed class. And let's give it a background color of dark violet and some padding to give it some space around the text. Here's the purple rectangle. Now let's also add position fixed. So now you might notice that the purple rectangle has shrunk to just the size of the content, and it's also stacking on top of the paragraph that comes after it. So it's taken out of the flow of the document, so the elements after it are going to move up to fill the space. And this is actually very similar to how it would look if it was position absolute. However, it looks different when you start scrolling because the element is fixed in the viewport in the same position that it was with the normal document flow. So let's explicitly position it with the inset shorthand property. And I'm going to set top to 0, right to 0, bottom to auto, and left to 0. There we go. So now it's been fixed to the top of the viewport, as well as the left side getting fixed to the left side, the right side getting fixed to the right side of the viewport, and the bottom is set to auto, meaning it's going to be controlled by the actual content inside. Instead of, if we set bottom to 0, it would fill up the entire viewport. So doing this is actually really useful if you want to make like a top navigation or a promo bar that you always want to be visible no matter where you scroll. Now, fixed elements are also going to stack, so you do want to be careful when using fixed elements just because the index of other elements may come into play and make things behave a little differently than what you were expecting. So for example, let's go to the gray parent div that we had here, and let's set the z-index to 1. So now when I scroll, you might notice that the gray parent div, as well as all of its child elements, are on top of the fixed div at the top. So you can fix this by making sure the z-index of your fixed element is higher than the z-index of the other elements on your page. So let's go back to our fixed element and we'll set a z-index of, let's say, 10. So this will just make sure it's going to be on top of other elements on the page. Now, position sticky is like a hybrid of static and fixed elements. So in our HTML, let's go maybe a few more paragraphs down. And I'm going to create a new div with a class of sticky. And I'll write this element is sticky. So in our styles, we'll target that sticky class. We'll set a background color of dark cyan. And let's make this one a bit taller. We'll say padding of 60 pixels on top and bottom, 20 on left and right. Then we'll also set position sticky. And we'll set a top of 0. Now when we save, the sticky div is not immediately visible. However, if we scroll down, we can see that it comes into view. So at the moment, it is acting like a regular static element and it's following the normal flow of the document. However, because it has a top of 0, when I keep scrolling and we hit the top of the viewport, it's going to stick to the top. And as you continue scrolling, it's just going to behave like a fixed element. So let's try setting bottom to 0. So currently it looks like a normal static element. However, when we scroll up, it's now going to stick to the bottom side of the viewport because of that bottom 0. And you can also set both top and bottom to 0. So now, here it is in the normal flow. If we scroll up, it sticks to the top, and if we scroll down, it sticks to the bottom. And the sticky element is also going to stack. So without a z-index, it's going to stack under the purple fixed div, but we can make it stack on top by setting it a z-index that's higher than what we had with a fixed element. So let's say z-index of 20. So now the sticky element is on top of the fixed one. So it all depends on what you want to be higher in the stack. All right, and that's it for the CSS position property. Next up, we're going to get more into the nitty-gritty of layouts with grid and flexbox.